main content. So I'm Robin, and I work with Jane and Kai at Face to Face HR. Here we are. I think both of you might be on the webinar joining us. So yeah, we are we're a HR consultancy that supports small businesses. We aim to take the HR load off their plates so that they can kind of focus on doing what they do best. So with it being Mental Health Awareness Week this week, we wanted to do this webinar and partner with Charlotte to kind of open up a conversation around how, as businesses, managers and colleagues, we can really work to support each other and to adapt to kind of the challenges that we all face, the stress that we face at work and you know, in our personal life, ultimately to help us to drive performance without risking burning out. So that's kind of the purpose of today's session. And I met with the lovely Charlotte about, I think I was trying to work it out, Charlotte. I think it was about 5 years ago. And I remember it was a very rainy day in Shoreditch. And I went along to Shoreditch House and I felt very fancy turning up to one of Charlotte's first events, I think, Charlotte. And you were running a mental health training, awareness training session. And honestly, the wisdom that Charlotte shared with me on that day has really stuck with me. And then I've subsequently attended a few other events that Charlotte's run as well. And she's just such a great job about in kind of providing us all with actionable tools that we can actually take forwards to support our own well-being and the well-being of people within the workplace. So hopefully you'll all find today's session really useful and take away some practical tips. So Charlotte, do you want to introduce yourself a bit further?
Yes, yeah, thank you. I'll stop the share so you can actually you'll actually see me. So my name's Charlotte Wiseman. As Robin said, I met her many years ago, and I've been working in the field of well-being and leadership and organizational well-being and culture since 2017. But sort of what brought me to this is my own experience of not looking after my own mental health at work. And that's something that's really important. I think that most people don't think about the importance of looking after their mind and their well-being until there is a problem. And that doesn't need to be that way. So my experience personally, I'll just give you a very short version of it, but I was in a fashion career. My first career was in fashion. I was running a design team, managing a few designers. And this was about 12 years ago. And I quite suddenly was put into a much more senior role where I was designing and managing all the production globally of this fashion brand. So I was managing all the design and production of this fashion brand. I was being asked to live in Bali for 6 months the year, travel the world. It was what looked like the dream job. And when someone hands you the dream job and says, go and do it, you do everything you can to prove that you can do it and hold on to it. And that's exactly what I did. I threw myself into the job, started working 6 days a week, because all my factories were open 6 days a week. And so why wouldn't I? I started working 14 and 16 hours a day because I was working with sales teams in the US. I was working with production lines in India, in China. So there was always someone online. And I wanted to help the people who I was working with, and I wanted to get the best results. And initially, it looked like that was happening. Sales were going up, things seemed to be going well, which reinforced that this was the right thing to do. And I kept going and I kept going and I kept going. And I didn't really think that anything was wrong. I thought that having some stomach problems was related to my, probably to something I'd eaten. I had back problems and physical hip and joint problems. And I thought that was because of my running. I was finding people were maybe not quite doing what I said, but I thought that was probably because they weren't up to the job and I was blaming other people. I was finding people were a little bit irritating at times. But again, I was externalizing a lot of the stuff that was going on. And it all changed for me one day when I was out in Indonesia and I had a normal, stressful day, I would say. I thought, being busy and stressed, that was normal in that day. But as I walked out of the factory at the end of the day, I walked into the heat of the air and I was suddenly hit by this feeling of, I cannot live another day like this. I can't go on. And it was that stark and sudden. I remember very distinctly standing in the road and looking up at this sign and thinking, something has to change, but I don't know what. I just can't do it. I just can't do it. I just can't do it. And that was all I could think was, I can't do it. I can't do it. And I remember desperately wanting to cry and not being able to cry. And I felt like there was nothing left of me to give. There wasn't even the energy there to do that. And two people walked out of the factory. They were visiting from the UK and they tried to talk to me. And as I opened my mouth, the words wouldn't come out. It was a very odd experience, but I was trying to speak and I couldn't. Anyway, in all their wonderful British wisdom, they did what probably most of your colleagues would do in that situation, which was suggest a drink, right? Alcohol. Yeah, let's go for a drink. You'll be fine after a glass of wine. You'll be fine after a G&T. If it's before 5 o'clock, people tend to go with the tea and a biscuit option. And they bundled me off. Anyway, to cut the long story short, I mean, all of this is available online if you want to read more, but it was that moment that for me was the catalyst to say, actually, mental health at work matters, and it needs to be a priority alongside looking after our performance and the skills and everything else. Because if we can't look after our mind, we can't perform at our best. And I, through my recovery, ended up making the decision to stay in work, to work through my recovery, which I'm very grateful for. I worked through that recovery, and as I was doing that with the help of therapy and other resources, I started to make tiny changes to my working patterns. And I also started to become a bit fascinated with the brain and how it functions at its best and how it reacts to stress, and what we can do so that we can be mentally fit and mentally healthy, even when we are under pressure and experiencing stress. And I think that's really a really important thing, that with Mental Health Awareness Week, the theme of this week is anxiety. And anxiety is a very normal thing, very useful thing that protects us and helps us in many ways. If it's not managed well, it can become a problem and can become an anxiety disorder. But life is always going to come with some pressure, some stress, and our ability to be mentally fit and to continue to perform, think clearly, make good decisions, and have a positive impact on others, it is fundamentally driven by our ability to deal with the normal ups and downs of life. So for me, once I was through my period of therapy, I started to study psychology alongside my job. I then eventually, 6 years ago, quit my job, went back and did a master's and studied specifically workplace mental health and positive psychology for organizations and positive leadership behaviors. So I now work with leaders and with businesses on developing leaders who can create the optimal conditions for people to think, feel, and perform at their best, and help organizations with their strategies around well-being, mental fitness, and that alignment of performance and outputs with well-being and sustainable performance. So that's a little bit of a, probably not that succinct, but a little bit of an insight to me, my background, and my hopefully what I can offer you today.
Thanks, Charlotte. I think it's fascinating to kind of hear that backstory as to how you've got involved in this, and also how you've lived a kind of normal working life. You know what it's like in workplaces. You know what can start to creep in and what can start to impact people's mental well-being. So those kind of insights really do play into the support that you can then give to the clients that you work with. So I guess, shall we start by looking at kind of what stress actually is? And I'm sure we've all had times where we felt stressed or anxious, and maybe we've experienced situations where actually a bit of stress has helped us to achieve something, and then probably times where it's all felt a little bit too much. So I know from personal experience that I've had that, that anxious feeling before I've gone into a big meeting or before I've gone into a job interview. And actually, when I finished that interview, I thought, oh, that bit of stress was great. That helped me to be alert and to perform at my best. But then I've also had times where I have had jobs where I feel like I've been living in that fight or flight state for just too long. And that doesn't feel as great. And then your performance does start to fall. So I guess, Charlotte, a question for you is, how can we, as managers, but also employees, determine how much stress is good for us? And then when we're getting towards that tipping point that you experienced?
It is a really fine line, a really difficult one. And unfortunately, I can't give people a tick list of what that is. The same way that what adds pressure and stress to one person will be different for another. What that tipping point will be often depends on the context of what's going on within that person's environment. But we kind of take a general look. Stress is considered to be the physical and psychological reaction that we have when we don't think we can deal with whatever's being put on us. So that's sort of the definition of stress. And depending on whether you're searching on a US website or a UK website, you'll often find that a stress and anxiety, the terminology, the definitions are pretty interchangeable. It's this feeling of, I can't cope. And one researcher I like that they said it's about usually too much of something, too little of something, too soon or too late. So it's the 4 twos. And if you have too much of anything or too little, too soon, too late, that will make us feel like we can't cope. With that, what it emphasizes is that actually not having enough to do can cause us just as much stress in work as having too much to do. Or when we're working on a project, having delays to it can be just as much stress to someone as a deadline suddenly being brought forward. So within a role of an HR team or a leadership team, we have to understand that communication around those kind of changes or understanding what is optimal has to be considered from both sides. When something is considered to be an anxiety disorder is when that pressure, that stress is starting to cause someone to not be able to do their job effectively. Now, when we talk generally about anxiety disorders, that is thinking about all the different things in someone's life. So it could be changes in their personal experiences, relationships, their living situation. It could be social change. It could be cultural impacts. But it'll be that person then can't think clearly, can't make decisions, or perhaps becomes quite defensive, quite aggressive. The symptoms can really vary, but it's that they aren't able to think, feel, form to their best ability. And it tends to last for about a period of 4 weeks before a doctor would give a diagnosis of an anxiety disorder. In the workplace, if something is largely driven by purely work pressures, that's when it might fall under the banner of someone experiencing burnout rather than anxiety. And the symptoms of burnout are slightly different to the symptoms of anxiety in that they are 3 quite specific symptoms, that someone has a sense of exhaustion. Whereas in anxiety, sometimes people feel exhausted or sometimes people feel very hyper energized. For burnout, it's definitely a depleted level of energy. With burnout, the definition would be cynicism. So people become quite cynical about the importance of their work, the value of their role, the importance or their own self-worth very often. So they become very cynical about things. And they also don't think they're doing a very good job. So it's inefficacy is the 3rd clinical word that we look for. And it's this often aren't doing as well a job as they would like to be doing because they are exhausted. They're not thinking clearly. They're rushing things. But on top of that, it's a very negative self-view of the output that's happening. Again, if that was compared to anxiety, and anxiety, sometimes people can be super confident with what they're doing and they can blame everyone else. Whereas within burnout, it's much more self-deprecating. So those are kind of the differences between anxiety and anxiety disorders and burnout. In terms of how we know that tipping point, it's a very, very fine line. What I can share with you is this model which we often teach in businesses, and we talk about the fact that if you're mentally fit, if you're at your best, you have a big resilience container, which means you can deal with pressure and stress and still perform well. And exactly as you said, Robin, when you've got the right level of pressure coming in for the size of your container, that pressure helps you to get stuff done, to make effective decisions, to focus and prioritize, and it's helpful. However, we all overflow at some point, and we show our own stress signatures. And in terms of knowing what our stress signatures is, that is the key. The more attuned we are to the early signs of that overflow, the better we can be about getting back on track by using our tap and releasing some of that stress. So, and I just check, can you see those slides there, Robin?
No.
I wondered that. I suddenly realized so I'm talking you through this graphic and you're not able to see it. So we all have this resilience container, and it's about being aware, what are the things that come into that container that cause us to overflow, and then becoming attuned to our own stress signature so we can take action. And it's helping individuals within businesses know that for themselves, and helping managers and leaders to know that not only in themselves, but in their team members, so they can step in sooner and say, okay, that person's been, I don't know, they've been just making a few more mistakes. Let me not wait till this gets a crisis point. Let me step in now and have that conversation. And it's also about helping people understand the very basic things which increase the size of that container. Things like sleep. If you're getting less than 6 or 7 hours of sleep a night, your amygdala, which is your stress response, is about 60% more reactive. So everything feels more stressful. If you aren't taking just 2 or 3 minutes breaks between meetings, by the 3rd meeting in a row, your brain is already in a heightened stress state, which means you're not going to be able to perform at your best. So it's about really education from across the board as to the things that increase that container, as well as helping people to manage the flow in, helping people to know the signature, and helping people to release.
That's so interesting. And I think a couple of things that I guess practical things that you could do within your businesses is, you know, if you're part of a leadership team or a management team, think about those things that could increase the size of that retainer. Like Charlotte said, you know, having 15-minute breaks between meetings, if that's possible, you know, allowing your team to you know, giving permission for those breaks, looking, you know, talking between yourselves as to the work that you're delegating, and making sure that, you know, not too much work is going on to one individual. But also, I think as managers, it just really stresses to me the importance of those one-to-ones and that open communication that businesses need to have, you know, managers need to have with their employees, because unless you're having those meetings, all you're seeing is the output of work that somebody's doing. You're not seeing what's going into that, and you're not having the conversations around that. And I think so often when, you know, Jane and I meet with clients, they're like, yeah, we have one-to-ones, we go through the to-do list for the week, that's our one-to-one. And we're like, there's so much more, you know, your one-to-one should not be going through a to-do list with your team member. They should be able to manage that themselves and come to you if there's issues with that. It should really be about, you know, asking the right questions, asking those open questions, asking how they are, asking what you can do better, you know, or differently to support them. And really getting, you know, understanding, we'll come on to this a bit more in a minute, but understanding those signs, because those signs for everybody will differ. Those signs of, you know, getting towards that tipping point, you know, as Charlotte said, could be that there's just a few more mistakes being made. So rather than going into that meeting and saying, telling them off for the mistakes that they've made or going straight into those mistakes, just ask how they are, because they'll probably come to you and there'll be a reason for it. If they've been performing well for a long time and then you notice a sudden change, that is often a sign that something is contributing to that. So I think just making sure that you're having those conversations, and between colleagues as well. You don't have to be somebody's manager. If you notice one of your colleagues is starting to change behavior or starting to show signs of not feeling great, then have those conversations with them in a safe space. But yeah, that's really helpful, Charlotte.
Yeah, I think on that one-to-one point, I think it's such an important point from onboarding. So often people, if they do anything in onboarding around mental health, it's much more, oh, here's who to go to if you've got a problem, rather than let's have that conversation up front so that you as an individual think through, how do you manage? What could we be looking out for? And that's the same when those managers one-to-ones. As a manager, you're not stepping in and solving their problems. You're creating a space for them to think about it so they can understand for themselves. Because if you don't create that space for them, they're probably not going to invest that time. So I think it's really important that just because you're having that conversation as a manager doesn't mean you need to be able to fix it. You just need to help them understand what they can do.
Yeah. And I think sometimes it can be difficult, can't it, to notice those signs in yourself. I know that I've had times where, I remember in my first job, my boss pulled me aside once and was like, are you feeling okay? Like, are you okay? And I was moving between flats and I was here, there and everywhere, and I had a lot going on in personal life, but I was so new into my job and into my career that I was just, doing what you said, Charlotte, just powering on regardless. And I know my husband sometimes pulls me up on it, and like my stress signs I think are quite obvious. I just do more and more and more, and then think that the more I do, the more that I will achieve, and then the less stress I'll be, which doesn't happen. And so when I'm frantically deciding to wash the kitchen floor at 10 p.m. at night, or like putting in another load of laundry, he's like, Robin, what's wrong? Slow down. Like, that he knows, and I know, but sometimes we need to take time ourselves to reflect on what those signs are, because they might be different in your personal life to what they are at work. We all manifest things differently in different situations. So I think maybe now we can all just take a couple of minutes to just think about, what behaviors do you exhibit? How do you feel when you're kind of getting into that state where you're starting to struggle? And I think Charlotte's got a few ideas that, like,
Is that showing for you there?
Yes, it is. So maybe these are just some examples, but maybe you can just think about yours and just tick any that resonate with you.
I mean, when you were asked how you were, Robin, that time, did you say I'm struggling, or did you say, oh, I'm fine when you
No, I did say that I was struggling. I think that I've had a good relationship with the lady who was my boss. I think it was, and I think how I've evolved over time is I don't wait to be asked now. I think as you kind of grow in your career, and Jane's great to work with, and I feel completely comfortable talking to her. And I think if you've got that manager who you can feel that, who you feel that you can approach with different things, you won't be met with judgment and a kind of, oh, I've moved house 100 times, it's fine, like I don't know what's going on, what are you worrying about? I think so over time I've learned that I'm moving again at the moment, and I said to Jane, I've got this going on at the moment, and you have that open communication before you reach that point, and so that manager's aware that there might be things that you need to do, or meetings that you need to attend. But I think sometimes, especially if you've got maybe more junior employees or new employees into the business, or some employees just aren't as open proactively just by nature. So I think sometimes it depends, doesn't it, on the type of person that you're managing and the level, whether you feel that the type of questions that you need to ask them. But yeah, this is really interesting. So we can see that lack of focus, very high. Being impatient with others, I can definitely resonate with that. I'm interested with that impatience with others, whether that shows up more at home or more at work, because sometimes we can be more impatient with some people than we can be with others, can't we?
Yeah, we definitely, when I talk to people in businesses, you tend to find that they will say that they're better at controlling it at work, and it's their family, their friends that they take it out on. And the other thing you could see from this is you might be able to think of that as your team. So for example, the lack of focus, you might notice that people are starting to arrive later at meetings, and that could be a collective stress signature sign. Or people are cancelling meetings right at the last minute, and that could be a collective sign. Or, you know, you're not having your one-to-ones with people because you feel like you're too busy. That could be your sign. So it's definitely insightful to think about this and to invest time in thinking about it, and to even, you know, feel free, if you would like to, if anyone thinks this model would be interesting to talk to their teams about, we can share a version with you which you could do with your teams or within individuals, where they have boxes to fill out and they think about it, and it frames a work, like a mini workshop you run, or an activity.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting, and I think it's
share those results as well so everyone else can see them.
Yeah, and I think as well as understanding the signs that your employees are showing, it's also worth, you know, and we're going to go on to this now, but talking about like the boundaries that they have, you know, they have in place. So Charlotte, do you want to talk a little bit more about boundaries and how those can be helpful when, you know, when managing a team?
Yeah, well, I think it is a really difficult. So my master's that I focused on CEO and leadership burnout, and definitely what they all spoke about is the difficulty these days that we can really keep doing everything at all times of day. And all those CEOs I spoke to spoke about the importance of finding an off switch so that there was some boundary between work and home life. And in the digital world, how hard that is. And even when, you know, even when we say, okay, well, I'll send an email to someone, I won't expect a reply till next week. If you send an email at 11 o'clock at night and someone sees that in their inbox, even if they don't have to reply, it's on their mind. So it's respecting your own boundaries as well as respecting boundaries for others. And often not relying on willpower to maintain boundaries is really crucial. So we know that the human mind, if it's left to its own devices, it's not going to be that well managed just by, oh, I'm not going to check my emails after 6 o'clock. We sometimes need to put stronger things in place to avoid those. And actually, there's a couple of the CEOs I spoke to, quite interesting. One of them said he every Friday night would delete the mail app from his phone so he couldn't check emails over the weekend, because he said he knew that was it. He said, if it was there, I would check it. If I removed it, I wouldn't be bothered to download it again. Another one said that he had to start taking up swimming because it was about the only place that he would honestly not check his email, because even on a running machine, he'd find himself checking his email while he was running. So really setting up strong boundaries for ourselves so that you can manage yourself, and understanding how you can help others do the same is really important. And the other thing I think around boundaries is knowing how much as an HR team, as a leader, you can realistically help others. You know, another lovely quote that came out of that research was, the biggest learning for me was, I'm not a superhero and I don't need to be. Because I'm doing more and more work now with HR and people functions, groups of people who feel they have to be there for everyone. And they know that if that person calls them at 6 o'clock at night, it must be serious. And so they're trying to help everyone and save everyone. And you can be there as a support, but at the end of the day, you have to look after yourself. And you're not a therapist, you know, you might be, but for most people, they're not therapists. You're there as a listening post, and you've got to be there to direct people to the relevant support, but you can't always save everyone or give beyond that, so that then it starts to be detrimental to your own well-being. So I think there's that boundary as well of self-management and not overcommitting to people.
Yeah, and I think, you know, you touched on there with boundaries for CEOs, but I think something that we see a lot of is, you know, employees not thinking that they are worthy of having boundaries themselves, and thinking that they need to be, you know, on call all the time. If their manager needs them, they must pick up, or they must be able to attend every meeting no matter what time of the day, and thinking that that's just what they have to do. And I think we're always talking to managers about, you know, listening and asking, you know, what are the boundaries that your team have, like what's important for them, because that will differ for everybody, and that, you know, their boundaries are equally important. And so, you know, we've had situations where somebody's, you know, said, you know, I have a really frantic, stressful, you know, morning. I have to get kids to school or whatever. And I would really appreciate if meetings could not start until 9:15, so I can get through the door, get a cup of tea, get my laptop set up, just see what I'm doing for the day before I launch straight into an email, straight into a meeting, sorry. And I think that's, you know, that's just an example where if that employee hadn't communicated that, then they may be showing up 5-10 minutes late for the first meeting of the day because they're just frantic and they just need to get their head in the right mindset before they start work. And I think, you know, for other people, it might just be like, you know, I'd really like to be able to leave on time so that I can get to a netball club or whatever it is, or something that's really important for them. And I think unless, as managers, you ask the questions in your one-to-ones, or however, you know, however you do it, like what's important to you, what makes the difference, you know, to you in your working week, and then looking at what you can do, you know, around that. Because often, and I've seen this again in myself, it's that gradual decline of starting to let go of those things, and starting to kind of think, oh, it doesn't matter, I'll just work late today and I'll miss netball, and then the next week I'll just work late today and I'll miss netball, and then over time that's 2 months of missing netball. You haven't done any exercise and you start to feel a bit rubbish, and it just builds up. So and then I think another thing that we talk about is creating that culture within a team of boundaries, and it really does need to come from the top down. So, you know, seeing that CEO turning off their emails and not responding over the weekend, or, you know, knowing that they go swimming after work, and, you know, that they do things for their health, talk about it. You know, if you're managing people, talk about what your boundaries are as well, and try and hold each other to account a bit more. So yeah, and I know many of
Sorry, I was going to say, I think what's just really important, Robin, just to pick up on that, is a lot of companies say, or people can say no to meetings if it doesn't work, but there's not real clear guidance on that. And so I think I very rarely speak to a company where you speak to employees and they honestly feel they can say no if they haven't got the capacity to, or if they don't think that they're going to be useful in a meeting. So I think making sure that everyone who does have meetings in knows why they're turning up, what they're supposed to either be giving to that meeting or getting from that meeting. And if they don't feel they are either giving something or getting, they know how to say no, and that is okay. I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of looking at it. And I think a lot of companies just by default have a morning status call at, you know, 9 o'clock every morning and expect everybody to be on there. But I think it's looking at maybe different ways that you can do that. If that is, you know, presenting a challenge to employees, it may not be, but you know, it will just depend. So Charlotte, I know, you know, many people on this call today are managing teams or responsible for employees. So as managers, you know, what can they be doing if they start to spot the signs? If they've spoken to their team member, they understand what their signs are, they know what the boundaries are, and they're starting to see these things slack a little bit. What can these managers do to support their team?
Well, I think the first thing is having the conversation. You know, it's exactly what you said. It's that one-to-one conversation. And if an individual is saying that, you know, they're fine, it's okay, you know, it's absolutely fine, and denying there's anything of an issue, it is okay as a manager to say, look, I've noticed X, Y, and Z. I know that that's unlike you, and to sort of reiterate that I'm not blaming your performance or whatever issues I've seen on this. I know you're a good person. So to really give people that that confidence and that clarity that they're not in trouble for this. This isn't I'm coming and telling you you're in trouble. I'm telling you because I care. And what we often start to see is that if an individual knows that because they're overwhelmed, they've been making mistakes, they'll very quickly get defensive about the work. They'll go, oh no, but I'm this, I'm sorry. And managers have to really say, look, let's put the work stuff to one side. How are you doing? And almost separate that. And you mentioned at the beginning, you know, the importance of having one-to-ones, which are about how people are doing. Some companies integrate those conversations where there's part about tasks and function, and part of that conversation is about well-being. But a lot of companies say, well, actually, we have one conversation which is about tasks and priorities, and another conversation around well-being. But definitely managers need to lean into those conversations, because the longer they are avoided, the bigger the issue is going to be and the harder it's going to be. When they do step in to have that conversation, if people don't want to talk, accept that, reiterate that you do want to, you do want to help. And if there's anything, you're available, but also make sure you point out who else they could talk to if you're not the one, because they might not want to talk to you. If they do open up, then your role is not to fix their issues. It's to thank them for sharing, and ask them what support they need. And if they say the support they need is you prioritizing stuff, or they need a couple of days off work, absolutely, that's fine. You can do that. But we need to give people as much ownership as we can over what support we give them, because it's very easy for managers to jump in and say, oh, well, I'll take you off that project. And that person, for that individual, that's really disempowering. And all they need is a little bit of support with that project. Or why don't you take a couple of days off? And actually, maybe for that person, that's not the best solution. So making sure it's a really shared decision making, and making sure that as a manager, we're not stepping into the role of advice giver or therapist. We're there as support and inspiration, for that individual to take the relevant action.
That's really, sorry, my mute button wasn't working there. Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think I see so often managers saying to me, I don't really know what to say to them because I don't know how I can help. And you think you don't need to help with the situation. You need to help them to you need to facilitate the changes that they need, but they need to come to you with what those are, because those will be different. And I have seen, times where managers really think they're doing the right thing. They're like, as you said, we'll take this away from you. Don't worry about this. I've got this. And actually then that person's left feeling, oh God, they think I can't cope. And or they're left feeling not very busy, and then that can bring struggles with, is my role safe, and things like that. So I think it is about asking the right questions to the employee and then supporting them through that, and maybe having more regular check-ins as well. And I think if it ever gets to the point as a business where you're really concerned for somebody's mental well-being, or it's starting to impact on attendance, definitely reach out to us. We support many clients with taking employees through occupational health, giving them access to actually trained health professional who can look at the adjustments that as a business you may want to make to support that employee with what they're going through. So there's different routes available when those situations arise. So hopefully you've all found that very useful. So we just wanted to open up the floor to all of you and ask if anyone's got any questions, anything that's going on at the moment, anything they may have dealt with in the past, anything that any questions that they'd like to ask Charlotte or I.
And you can do that in the chat function, or put your hand up and we can unmute as well. Both options available to you. Oh, I see Rosie's put her hand up there, Robin.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah. Do you want to unmute yourself, Rosie, and ask us?
Just want to say that one of my people was struggling, and I was recommended by you to put him through this wellness action plan, which is a set of questions to discuss how we can help make their working experience better. And I was initially very skeptical. I thought, oh, this is going to be silly, this is going to be awkward and embarrassing and not actually come up with anything. But I actually found it was a really useful exercise to get to fully understand exactly what triggers happened and how we could help to mitigate those.
That's yeah, I think you're right, Rosie, like that we kind of talked you through how to kind of go through that wellness action plan, which is a wellness action plan that's been put together by Mind, and it's a way of facilitating a conversation between a manager and employee. So it should be used when there is a situation that, you know, an employee is struggling with. You wouldn't necessarily just use it in a general kind of one-to-one. If an employee's come to you and said, I'm struggling with this, or, you know, I'm finding it hard to cope with this, then, you know, it helps give you a bit of a framework to approach that conversation, but also to understand exactly, you know, what it is that employee would benefit from. Have you seen people using the wellness action plan, Charlotte?
Yeah, we, in all our managers training, we talk through managers how to do it. We also actually encourage people to do it not just when an issue arises. We encourage people to do it as part of an onboarding, an edited version, which is, how do you keep yourself at your best? How do we notice if you're struggling? What do you think might be the things that you find hardest? Because the sooner you can create that relationship, and I think this links into Ella's question there about how open you can be with a manager. If you build that relationship before there's an issue, then if an issue arises, you're already at this very safe space where you do understand each other and you know, and you're comfortable. If a manager has never asked how you feel, never talked to you about your well-being, and then suddenly steps in and says, how are you feeling? It's never going to be a really comfortable and fruitful conversation. So I think the Wellness Action Plan is a great system. We have a slightly reduced one that we do, and we encourage to be used in onboarding processes, in team building sessions, just to get that sense of we're all going through this and we're all here to support each other without being each other's therapists.
Yeah, I love that idea, actually. That is a great idea. That's not something I've thought of before. And I think you're right. Like, you don't, I can imagine it's very difficult as a manager to have just had kind of, you know, task-based conversations, work-related conversations, and then to launch into how are you, how are you feeling kind of thing. So yeah, that's a great idea.
Ella's asked there, how open can you be with a manager? And I think that's a really, well, a very difficult question. Ella, are you open to telling us what your thinking is behind that? No. So I'm just wondering whether you're thinking, how open can you be from you know, what will be shared, what won't be shared, if this is a confidentiality?
Yeah, sorry, I've just
yeah.
Yeah, it was just in regards to kind of, if you do have personal issues and stuff like that, can you, just kind of how open can you be with that? Or yeah, like, I know it's a really hard fine line, and you can't really define an answer, but yeah, just kind of that balance, really.
Yeah. But I guess I can say from experience, I've worked with some companies who are very progressive in this space, and the relationships, even in those, some managers, people will feel totally open, sharing absolutely everything that's going on in their personal, professional life. And some managers encourage and welcome that. Other managers don't have that relationship with team members. And that doesn't mean they can't support them. You don't need to know the nuances of what someone's going on, what is going on outside of work to be able to support someone.
Yeah.
So there's no real line of what you should or shouldn't share and what you can and can't share. I think the key is that as a manager, you agree with that individual, the confidentiality of things. And usually that's a really difficult thing, because, you know, you do want to flag things if they are going to be potentially a risk, but you also don't want to lose the trust of that individual. But you do need to agree with them what is going to be shared and what isn't. And I also think you need to know as a manager or as an individual that your manager can help you if you say there's some stuff going on outside of work that I prefer not to talk about, but I'm finding it tough. That's okay. That's absolutely okay to share without going into more detail than you're comfortable with.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I also think, just to add to that, Ella, like, you know, when we're advising managers on having, you know, difficult conversations with employees, we really stress the importance of preparation and just practicing what you're saying. And I think in these, you know, in these situations that, you know, as an employee, if you're going to your manager about something, it can be quite emotive, and at times people, you know, naturally will get upset, and it can be quite hard to articulate how you're feeling about a certain situation or what is going on for you. So it may just be worth as well, like, you know, ahead of those conversations, just practicing out loud in your mirror, or, you know, just what you want to say and what you want to articulate, and also, you know, how your manager can support you through that, and that can help you in that moment to be able to articulate what you want to say kind of coherently, but also not, you know, don't be afraid to get upset. You know, these things, you know, can happen. So I think we've just got another question come through from Jane. So Charlotte, how employee-led do you think these conversations should be? Should managers schedule regular check-ins for all their people, or allow their team members to decide how often these type of conversations take place?
I actually suppose it's a great question, and I think it's a bit of a balance of both, in that they definitely need to be booked in by managers for many reasons, but I guess the main reasons being lots of people won't know that there's an issue, exactly as you said, Robin, is exactly as I mentioned, that unless you make the time and you invest the time in sitting down and saying, oh, wait there, how am I on a 1 to 10? What's making me a 6? What's making me a 5? That is probably, it can be very easily ignored until things are very bad. So there is that. There is also the fact that if managers don't have a really obvious space in their diary, people might not want to go and check in and book that in. So many managers, you know, their diaries are back to back, or people know they're busy and they go, oh, I don't want to interrupt them. It's not a big deal. There's people worse off, so they won't interrupt for that reason, because they're trying to respect the manager, or simply they don't feel comfortable. They've never spoken to someone about how they feel or their mental health, and this is like a massive thing. So to not only have to have that conversation, but to initiate that conversation is a huge ask. So it is about managers booking this in. It is also about then the manager working out what the best cadence of that is, because depending on the project, depending on the individual, depending on the relationship and the way you work, it might be that is once every week. It might be that that's once every 2 weeks. I would suggest at least, you know, a minimum of once a month, even if that's a 10 or a 15-minute check-in. That is the absolutely bare minimum, because a lot can change within a month, and them not needing to be long. You know, you can book in a 15 or a half an hour conversation, and if you finish in less time, that's fine. Don't do the drag of, oh, let's just use this time for the sake of it. And that can be just, again, managers saying, does this feel about right? Would you like longer next time? When do you think would be the best time for us to speak next? And creating that kind of co-decision making in those sessions.
That's so helpful. Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions before we wrap up? No? Well, Charlotte and I have really enjoyed chatting to you today, and you know, talking through all of this. I think it's so important, not only just because it's Mental Health Awareness Week, but at all times, you know, to be having these conversations with employees and to be kind of upskilling yourself as managers and as to how to kind of best support your team. You know, Jane and I at Face to Face HR, we're available, you know, if anybody has any questions, specific things that are going on with their team, anything they'd like to talk through. And Charlotte, you know, Charlotte runs a lot of mental health training workshops and training for managers as well. So, you know, she'll be available if anybody wants to discuss that further with her. But I think before we leave, just wanted to ask you all kind of 3 things. So what is your main learning from today? What have you taken away from today's session? And then what thing will you start or stop doing as a result of the learnings from today? And which one person will you speak to about this session and maybe share some words of wisdom that you've learned? Feel free to write anything in the chat or just take this away with you to think about for the rest of your day.
And then I'll also share if anyone wants to do a session for their team, I'm happy to offer a reduced rate for anyone who's joined today to get that started, because I think it's a really, really important thing. So if you've been thinking about doing a session for your team, then just let me know and I'm happy to do something for you.
Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you. So yeah, I hope you've all found today useful, and do reach out to us with any further questions. So I think we'll be sending around a little feedback form at the end of the session to your email addresses, and we will also send over, oh, here we go, we've got a QR code.
We could send the link as well, but for some
Yeah.
people it's easier to just do it here and now. So
it's very tech savvy, Charlotte. Yeah, so if you just scan that QR code, you should be able to fill in a feedback form for us. It's really helpful to get your insights and feedback, and then we'll share the recording so that you can refer back to this, you know, as things may arise in the future. But thank you again for spending your lunchtime with us, and yeah, we hope you have a good rest of the day. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Carolyn, for sharing that action. Glad you're going to take it away.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Should we stay on for a minute, Charlotte, in case anyone has any questions?
Yeah, happy to do that. And I'll stop that recording.
Yeah, that'd be great.